Okay, now let's talk about stick shuttles and other shuttle options you have for a rigid heddle loom. When I wove this sample strap here, I used the shortest stick shuttle I had available, which was not very short, but it was shorter than the one that came with the loom. And I pretty quickly realized once I had emptied off this shuttle that I was going to achieve much better results. So this is about a 4-inch wide strap woven width. I was going to achieve similar results with a lot less work if I just ditched the shuttle and used my hands to push across 4 inches. It was just no big deal. So I would start a length of weft, and I would just open the shed and I would pass the thread from one hand to the other, and then I would beat. I probably could have gotten similar results with a belt shuttle, and I have several of those to go with my Inca loom. But for reasons of probably laziness that I didn't want to get up and get another shuttle, I just used my hands. And since I was using lengths of yarn that were, I'm going to say, well, I can give you a sense right here. Okay, so this was a length of warp yarn that I had taken off the loom to weave the strap. So 25, 50, so about 6 feet strands. Um, Again, just using my hands was a lot easier. So what are some other options you have as a rigid heddle weaver that would work well for a project on your rigid heddle loom? Well, stick shuttles work great as long as you have a wide variety of widths. And in fact, when I get into work this week, I am going to order some shorter stick shuttles because the rule about stick shuttles is whatever you're weaving for any given project, you want your shuttle to be just a little bit wider than the weaving width of your project or the reed width of your project. Because what you don't want to have to do is keep poking, poking, poking with the stick shuttle and pushing it across with your hand. You want to be able to lay it in that shed, and it needs to go out both sides of the shed. And then you don't have any problems. You don't have to worry about catching warp threads on these ends. Everything moves more smoothly. But conversely, when you're working with a shuttle that's way wider than your shed, or sorry, way wider than your project, you're wasting a lot of time and energy just trying to manipulate this thing that's much, much wider than you need. The other uh, drawback to stick shuttles is that, especially when you're using a really long one, is you have to have that same amount of length available on each side of your loom. So I'm going to back this camera up a little bit to show you how positioning your rigid heddle loom carefully can mean the difference between weaving smoothly and easily or cussing every time you poke your stick shuttle into the things on either side of your loom. Okay, so this should give you an idea of I have just barely enough room to the right of my loom to use a shuttle this long, but it would be tight and it would be better if I moved this chair completely out of the way and if I moved the whole loom back so that I wouldn't have any obstructions. And this basket totally has to go if I'm going to leave the loom in this position on the floor. Uh, this little table is low enough that it is not going to impede the movement of my stick shuttle, but still, this is 25 inches ish. I can't remember the exact length of it. And it's just, you need a lot of space on either side to manipulate a piece of wood that is that long and doesn't bend and doesn't adjust to things that are in the way. Other options you have for rigid heddle weaving are boat shuttles. So this is this is a Shack 9-inch mini boat shuttle, and in fact, this came with my 15-inch loom that I used to rigid heddle loom that I used to have. Uh, this is smaller in height. It's got a shorter profile than some of our other boat shuttles. And so it is petite enough to fit in the shorter shed of a rigid heddle loom. So on a floor loom, you're going to get a nice big shed, and you don't need, unless you want to, you don't necessarily need to use a low profile shuttle. But on a rigid heddle loom, you're just never going to get, there's just not enough space. Because remember that the threads are only going to go as high as this wood bar on the top of the heddle. And that is a space of, I'm going to say, inch and a half, so 2 inches tops. So you need a low profile boat shuttle. Also, with boat shuttles, you do need other winding equipment. I never used a boat shuttle in all my years of weaving until I got my first baby wolf loom, because I didn't have the money. I didn't have the money to invest in a bobbin winder. I didn't have the money to invest in the shuttles themselves. Because remember, you never ever want to get into weaving owning only one or even two shuttles. You always need more. There's no such thing as too much shuttles. It's like saying you've had too much chocolate. It's just not possible. So I stuck to stick shuttles, and when I made the switch to boat shuttles, I was really, really happy, but it did require an investment. And of course, once I went to end delivery shuttles, which you can see in one of my other videos, uh, and I needed to wind perns, I needed a double end bobbin winder, and those are even more expensive. Fortunately, I have friends who weave or were starting to weave, and they got some pretty generous gifts out of this whole thing. So you might say, well, Deb, if it was going to be easier to weave the strap with the boat shuttle, why didn't you just do that? And this is the reason, the bobbin. I know from sad experience that every time I try to wind a big chunky yarn onto one of these plastic bobbins, it feels like I get 10 yards on there before it's full, because you don't want the full bobbin to you don't want the yarn to go over these ends on the bobbin, and you don't want the bobbin itself to be higher, fatter than the height of the shuttle, or that motion of gliding smoothly across gets impeded. Lastly, if you've woven on floor looms or table looms with a shuttle race, moving to rigid heddle can be really disconcerting because there is no shuttle race. So when I'm on my floor loom, I can just shoot this right across the bottom of the beater, and it's gonna glide right across. But when you don't have anything supporting these warp ends right next to the heddle, the rigid heddle, you don't have anything to shoot across. You have to pass it across. So for all of these reasons, I have never gotten into rigid heddle weaving with a boat shuttle, and I generally stick to my stick shuttles. But as I said, this week I'm going to be using that sweet, sweet employee discount to invest in a larger variety of sizes, because these are just too unwieldy for every project I could ever weave on my flip. And as you can see, I can go as narrow as 4 inches. And yeah, so shuttles are great. Get a lot of them. Get varieties of them. Get them, if they're stick shuttles, in different sizes, and you will be a much happier weaver.